The great hall of the Galactic Council was silent as Ambassador Vethkora stepped forward to address the assembled delegates. Her silver scales shimmering under the artificial lights that hung from the ceiling like frozen stars. And every eye in the chamber turned toward her with a mixture of curiosity and concern that she had rarely witnessed in her 300 years of diplomatic service. She raised one slender claw toward the massive holographic map that dominated the center of the room. A map that showed every known star system, every colonized world, every trade route and military outpost that the 300 species of the Council had built over 50,000 years of cooperation and occasional conflict. And she pointed at something that made the assembled delegates lean forward in their seats. "The terminus void," she announced, her voice echoing through the chamber, "has always marked the edge of our civilization, the boundary beyond which no probe has ever returned, no signal has ever penetrated, and no living being has ever ventured and come back to tell the tale." Elder Counselor Morath, a being of pure crystalline energy who had served on the council for longer than most species had existed, pulsed with a blue light that indicated skepticism and perhaps a touch of impatience. For he had heard many speeches in his time, and few of them had warranted emergency sessions. "Ambassador Vethkora," he said in a voice that resonated like wind chimes in a storm, "we are all aware of the terminus void and its mysteries, so please explain why you have called us here with such urgency." Vethkora took a deep breath, something her species did when preparing to deliver news that would change everything, as she spoke the words that would reshape galactic history forever. 3 cycles ago, a vessel emerged from the void, a ship of unknown design carrying beings we have never encountered. Beings who call themselves humans and who claim that the darkness we have feared for millennia is their home. The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates shouted questions and demands, as old enemies found common ground in their shock, and ancient allies turned to each other with expressions of disbelief. And it took nearly an hour for order to be restored. Far from the council chambers, in the cold space between stars, Captain Samuel Briggs stood on the bridge of the starship Endeavour and watched the alien station grow larger through the viewport. A structure of elegant curves and shimmering materials that made his own vessel look like a rough stone beside a polished diamond. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with gray streaking through his dark hair and lines on his face that spoke of decades spent in the depths of space. Decades of decisions that had cost lives and saved others. Decades of carrying the weight of command on shoulders that had grown accustomed to the burden. "They have 47 weapons platforms tracking us," reported Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos. His first officer, a woman whose calm demeanor had earned her the nickname Ice Queen among the crew, though those who knew her well understood that beneath that cool exterior beat a heart as warm as any. Samuel allowed himself a small smile as he studied the tactical display and considered the fear that must be running through the alien station at this very moment. Fear of the unknown. Fear of creatures who had emerged from a place they considered impossible to survive. "Can you blame them for being nervous?" he said. "When we just walked out of their version of hell." The terminus void was not the empty wasteland that the Council believed it to be. And humanity had learned this truth the hard way when the first colony ships had ventured into its depths 3 centuries ago, seeking new worlds far from the crowded systems of their origin. They had found challenges that would have broken any other species. Radiation storms that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. Gravitational anomalies that crushed ships into particles smaller than atoms. And predatory organisms that existed in the spaces between dimensions and fed on the thoughts of living beings. And humanity had not merely survived these horrors, but had thrived among them. Had built cities in places where physics itself seemed to rebel against existence. Had raised children who knew no fear of the darkness because the darkness was all they had ever known. Incoming transmission from the station. announced Communications Officer Kevin Park, a young man whose skills with alien languages had proven invaluable during their journey into Council space. And they are requesting permission to send a diplomatic delegation aboard. Samuel straightened his uniform, a simple garment of gray and blue that bore no medals or decorations despite his many accomplishments. For humanity had learned long ago that true honor needed no advertisement. "Tell them we would be happy to receive them," he said. "And Kevin, make sure we have refreshments ready, because I have a feeling this conversation is going to take a while." In the council chambers, the debate continued as species that had not spoken to one another in centuries suddenly found themselves united in their uncertainty about the strangers from the void. High Warden Zex of the Korthan Empire, a massive creature covered in thick armor plates who had built his reputation on military conquests, slammed one heavy fist against his podium and demanded answers. "How do we know these humans are not a threat?" he roared. "How do we know they have not come to conquer us, to take everything we have built over thousands of years?" Vethkora raised her claws in a gesture of calm that she did not entirely feel, for she shared many of the same concerns, even if her diplomatic training prevented her from expressing them so bluntly. "We know very little about them," she admitted, "but they have made no hostile moves. They have responded to our communications with courtesy and patience, and they have requested nothing except the opportunity to speak with us." Morith flickered with colors that suggested deep thought and perhaps a wisdom born of ages beyond counting, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall like waves upon a shore. "We have always believed that the universe ended at the boundary of the void," he said. "But perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps there is more to existence than our maps have shown us. And perhaps these humans have come to teach us lessons we never knew we needed to learn." Back on the Endeavor, Samuel Briggs stood before a viewport and stared out at the stars that surrounded them. Stars that the Council had mapped and catalogued and claimed as their own, never suspecting that beyond the darkness lay a civilization that had learned to thrive where they feared to tread. He thought of Earth, the world his ancestors had left behind so long ago that it existed now only in stories and songs. And he thought of all the generations of humans who had fought and died and loved and hoped in the depths of the void, building something new from nothing but determination and courage. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly to Maria, who had come to stand beside him, "we need them to understand that we are not their enemies, that we have come seeking friendship and alliance, because something far worse than anything they have imagined is coming. And if we do not stand together, we will all fall apart." Maria nodded, her expression serious but not afraid. For she had grown up in the void and knew that fear was a luxury that survivors could not afford. And she placed one hand briefly on his shoulder before turning back to her duties. The docking clamps engaged with a soft thump that echoed through the hull, and Samuel Briggs walked toward the airlock to greet the beings who had never known darkness. The beings who were about to learn that the universe was far larger and far more dangerous than they had ever dreamed, and that humanity stood ready to guide them through the night. The council delegation walked through the corridors of the Endeavor with eyes wide and movements careful, as if they expected the walls themselves to attack them at any moment. And Vethkora found herself studying every detail of the human vessel with the trained awareness of a diplomat who knew that small things often revealed great truths. The ship was not beautiful by the standards she had grown accustomed to during her centuries of service, for its lines were rough and functional rather than elegant, its surfaces marked by countless repairs and modifications that spoke of battles fought and barely survived. And yet, there was something in its construction that commanded respect. "Your vessel has seen considerable conflict," she observed as Captain Briggs led them toward a conference room at the heart of the ship. And she noticed how the human crew members they passed stood a little straighter when their captain walked by, not from fear, but from genuine admiration. Samuel nodded, his expression carrying memories that Vethkora could not begin to understand. Memories written in scars both visible and hidden beneath the surface. The Endeavor is one of our older ships, he explained. Built during what we call the Hive Wars about 200 years ago. And we have upgraded her many times since then. But some scars we keep, because they remind us of what we have overcome. Elder Counselor Morath, who had insisted on joining the delegation despite concerns about his safety, flickered with intense curiosity that made him glow brighter than usual. The Hive Wars, he repeated. We have no record of any conflict by that name in our histories, so please tell us what happened. Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos spoke then, her voice carrying the weight of collective memory that every human child learned before they could walk. Stories passed down through generations like precious treasures. The Hive was what we called them, she said. Insectoid organisms that came from somewhere deeper in the void, drawn by the energy signatures of our early colonies. And they consumed everything in their path, ships and stations and entire worlds, leaving nothing but empty husks behind. She paused at a memorial wall that lined one section of the corridor, where thousands of names were carved in simple letters. Names of men and women and children who had given everything so that others might live. We fought them for 60 years, Maria continued. And during that time, 12 billion humans died, entire generations wiped out. Our civilization reduced to a handful of fortress worlds that we defended with every weapon we could build and every trick we could devise. Vethkora felt something cold settle in her chest as she listened. Something that might have been horror or might have been awe. For the Council had faced threats before, but nothing on such a scale. Nothing that could claim billions of lives and still be defeated. How did you survive? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How did you win against such overwhelming odds? Samuel turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something that she had never encountered in all her years of dealing with hundreds of different species. A quiet determination that burned like a star that refused to die. We learned, he said simply. We adapted. We changed ourselves in ways that would have seemed impossible before the war began. And when we finally found a way to destroy their queen minds, we did not hesitate, we did not show mercy. We did what needed to be done. The conference room was sparse, but functional, with a long table surrounded by chairs designed to accommodate beings of various sizes and shapes. And Samuel took his seat at the head, while his officers arranged themselves on either side. Please, he said, gesturing for the delegation to sit. We have much to discuss, and I believe honesty will serve us better than diplomacy. Dr. Laura Kim, the ship's medical officer, offered refreshments with genuine warmth that seemed to surprise the alien delegates, who had perhaps expected humans to be cold and hostile given their brutal history. Morath settled his crystalline form into something resembling a seated position and regarded Samuel with the patience of someone who had outlived countless civilizations. You spoke of something coming, he said, something that made you seek us out after centuries of isolation. So tell us, what threatens the galaxy now? Samuel nodded to Kevin Park, who activated a holographic display that filled the center of the table with images. That made several of the delegates recoil in shock. We call it the Hollow, Samuel explained. A swarm of interconnected organisms, each one the size of a small moon, moving through the deepest regions of the void toward Council space. The images showed sensor readings and long-range scans, showed the wreckage of scout ships that had ventured too close to the approaching threat, showed worlds stripped of all life and energy until nothing remained but dead rock floating in endless night. They consume stars, Maria added, her voice grim. They feed on the energy of dying suns, and they leave nothing but darkness in their wake. And our projections indicate they will reach the boundary of your space in approximately 18 months. Vethkora stared at the images with growing dread, her silver scales losing some of their luster as the implications of what she was seeing began to sink in. "Why warn us?" she demanded. "Why not simply retreat deeper into the void and let them destroy us, then claim our territories for yourselves when the threat has passed?" Samuel leaned forward, his expression intense but not threatening, and he spoke with a sincerity that was impossible to fake. "Because the Hollow is beyond even our capabilities," he admitted. "Because we have fought them in the depths of the void and we have lost. Lost ships and stations and people we loved, and we know that alone we cannot stop them." He looked around the table at each of the alien delegates in turn, meeting their eyes or equivalent sensory organs with unwavering directness. "We need you," he said. "We need your numbers, your resources, your different ways of thinking, because together we might find a way to defeat them, but alone we will all fall." Morath flickered with colors that suggested deep contemplation, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of ages. "You ask us to trust strangers who emerge from a place we believed was death itself," he said. "You ask us to prepare for a war against enemies we cannot see, based on nothing but your word." Samuel nodded, understanding the difficulty of what he was asking, understanding that trust could not be demanded but had to be earned. "Yes," he said, "I'm asking exactly that, and I know it is not easy. But I am also offering something in return, something that might help you decide." He stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the alien station that represented everything the Council had built over millennia. "We will share everything we know," he said. "Our technology, our tactics, our history, every secret we have learned in 3 centuries of surviving the void. And we will fight beside you when the time comes. Not as conquerors or overlords, but as partners and equals." Vethkora rose from her seat and joined him at the viewport, her reflection ghostly beside his in the transparent material. "The Council will debate," she said. "There will be those who refuse to believe, those who call you liars and manipulators. But I believe you, Captain Briggs. I believe that you have come to save us. And I will do everything in my power to convince the others." Samuel looked at her with something like gratitude, and perhaps the first stirrings of friendship between species that had never known each other existed until now. "That is all I can ask," he said. "And whatever happens, know that humanity will stand with you in the darkness, because the darkness is where we learn to survive, and we will teach you everything we know." The weeks that followed brought a constant stream of visitors to the Endeavor, as delegations from dozens of species came to study the humans and judge whether they could be trusted. And Samuel Briggs welcomed each one with patience that his crew sometimes found remarkable. Lieutenant Amy Chun, the ship's chief engineer, spent her days surrounded by alien scientists who asked endless questions about human technology, their curiosity overcoming their initial fear as they began to understand how differently humans approach the challenges of survival. "Your engines are fascinating," said a young Cythrian researcher named Keth, his scales flickering with colors that indicated intense concentration as he studied a schematic on his datapad. "They seem deliberately unstable, almost dangerous. And I cannot understand why you would design something that could explode at any moment." Amy smiled, pushing back a strand of dark hair that escaped from her ponytail, and she gestured for Keth to follow her deeper into the engineering section. "Because stable reactors do not produce enough power," she explained. "In the void, we need engines that can punch through interference fields and radiation storms. Engines that run hot and fast even if they sometimes fail." She showed him the backup systems, the redundant safety measures, the emergency protocols that had been developed over centuries of trial and error. "Yes, we lose ships sometimes," she admitted, "but we also travel farther and faster than anyone thought possible. And in the void, that speed is often the difference between life and death." Keth studied the systems with growing amazement, beginning to understand that human technology was not primitive, but simply designed with different priorities. Priorities that valued survival over elegance and function over form. Meanwhile, Colonel Christopher Wade conducted training sessions for alien military officers who wanted to understand human combat tactics. And these sessions often left the participants disturbed but enlightened. Your doctrine emphasizes preservation of forces, Chris explained to a room full of officers from a dozen different species. Minimal casualties, strategic withdrawal, negotiated peace. And these approaches have served you well against enemies who think the same way. He activated a holographic display that showed recordings of human battles against the creatures of the void. Images of ships ramming into enemy formations. Of soldiers fighting hand-to-hand against nightmares that defied description. But the Hollow does not negotiate, he continued. They do not accept surrender or retreat. They simply consume everything in their path. And the only response they understand is total, absolute destruction. A Corthan officer, one of High Warden Zex's subordinates, raised a massive hand covered in armor plates. You speak of tactics that the Council banned thousands of years ago, he said. Tactics considered barbaric and uncivilized, so why should we abandon our principles now? Chris met his gaze without flinching, his expression carrying memories of friends lost and battles won at terrible cost. Because your principles will not protect you, he said simply. When the Hollow comes, they will eat your children while you debate ethics. And sometimes survival requires becoming something ugly, something you never wanted to be. Not everyone agreed with the human methods, and there were protests and arguments and officers who refused to participate. But as the months passed and the long-range sensors showed the Hollow drawing ever closer, resistance began to fade. In his quarters, Samuel found himself spending more time with Vethkora, who had become something like a friend, despite the vast differences between their species. I do not understand your people, she admitted one evening, sharing a drink that humans called whiskey, and that burned pleasantly as it went down. You have suffered more than any species in our records. You have lost billions of lives, and yet you seem almost grateful for your hardships. Samuel considered his response carefully, swirling the amber liquid in his glass as he thought about generations of humans who had lived and died in the void. Suffering can destroy you, he said at last. It can break you into pieces so small that nothing remains. But it can also forge you into something stronger, something that could never exist without the fire. He gestured toward the viewport, where the darkness of space stretched in every direction, beautiful and terrible and infinite. Your people fear the void, he observed. You see it as an ending, a place where life cannot exist, but we see it as home, as a teacher that showed us what we were capable of becoming. Vethkora considered his words, her silver scales shimmering in the low light of the cabin. And what did you become? She asked. What did the void teach you that we have not learned in 50,000 years of civilization? Samuel smiled, an expression that carried both sadness and pride in equal measure. That every moment of peace is precious, he said. That every life saved is a victory worth celebrating. That we should never take anything for granted, because we know how quickly it can all be taken away. He leaned forward, his eyes intense with something that might have been passion or might have been the accumulated wisdom of a species forged in darkness. Your people have grown comfortable, he continued. You have forgotten that the universe is dangerous, that survival is never guaranteed, and that sometimes the greatest threat comes from the places you never thought to look. Vethkora nodded slowly, beginning to understand something fundamental about these strange beings from beyond the map. You are trying to prepare us, she said, not just for the Hollow but for a different way of thinking, a way of seeing the universe that does not assume safety or peace. Samuel raised his glass in a gesture of acknowledgement. The darkness is coming, he said. whether you are ready for it or not, and we would rather you survive to rebuild than perish in ignorance." Back in the council chambers, the debate continued with growing intensity as more species learned about the human warnings and the evidence they had provided. Some demanded immediate preparation for war, wanting to build fleets and weapons and defensive stations that could hold back the approaching storm. Others argued for isolation, hoping that if they hid quietly enough, the Hollow would pass them by and seek easier prey elsewhere. A few even suggested sacrificing the outer colonies, abandoning billions of lives to buy time for the inner worlds to prepare. And still others refused to believe the threat was real at all, calling the humans liars and manipulators who sought to trick the council into exhausting its resources. "This is exactly what they want," High Warden Zex declared during one particularly heated session. "They emerged from nowhere, claiming to be our saviors. But how do we know they did not create this threat themselves? How do we know the Hollow is not their weapon?" Vethkora stood to address his accusations, her diplomatic training pushed to its limits by the stubbornness of those who refused to see the truth. "I have spent months studying these humans," she said. "I have walked their ships, spoken with their people, learned their history, and I tell you now that they are not our enemies." She activated the holographic display, showing images of human children playing in the corridors of void stations, of families gathering for meals under artificial lights, of ordinary people living ordinary lives in a place that should have killed them. "They have nothing to gain from deceiving us," she continued. "They could have remained hidden in their darkness forever. But instead they chose to warn us, to offer alliance, to stand beside us against a threat that will destroy us all if we do not work together." The chamber fell silent as her words sank in, and for a moment Vethkora dared to hope that wisdom might prevail over fear. The vote came after 3 weeks of debate that had left the council chambers echoing with arguments and accusations. And Samuel Briggs stood alone before the assembled delegates as they prepared to decide the fate of the galaxy. He wore no weapons and no armor, just a simple gray uniform of the human fleet, and he faced the eyes of 300 species without showing any fear or uncertainty. "I know what we are asking," he said, his voice clear and steady in the vast chamber. "We are asking you to trust strangers who emerged from a place you believed was death itself, to prepare for war against an enemy you cannot see, based on nothing but our word." He paused, letting his gaze move across the assembled delegates, noting which ones leaned forward with interest and which ones crossed their arms in skepticism. "But consider this," he continued. "If we wanted to destroy you, we would not have warned you. We would have waited in our darkness until the Hollow had done its work, then claimed your shattered worlds for ourselves without losing a single ship." High Warden Zex rose from his seat, his massive form casting a shadow across several smaller delegates. "Pretty words," he growled, "but words prove nothing. And I still say this is a trick designed to weaken us, to make us exhaust our resources fighting a phantom enemy so that you can strike when we are vulnerable." Samuel nodded, accepting the criticism without anger or defensiveness. "You are right to be cautious," he admitted. "In your position, I would have the same doubts. But I ask you to look at the evidence we have provided, to study the sensor readings and the wreckage of our scout ships, and to ask yourself what we could possibly gain from such an elaborate deception." Vethkora rose to stand beside him, her silver scales catching the light as she turned to address her fellow delegates. "I have verified the human data with our own instruments," she announced, "and I can confirm that something massive is approaching from the void, something that matches their descriptions of the Hollow, and we have perhaps 16 months before it reaches our borders." The chamber erupted into renewed debate as delegates argued with each other and with their aides. But when the vote was finally called, the result was closer than anyone had expected. 3 species abstained, unwilling to commit either way. 12 voted against alliance, including the Korthan Empire and several other military powers who distrusted the strangers from the darkness. But the majority voted yes, choosing to trust the humans and prepare for the coming storm. Samuel bowed his head briefly in gratitude, then raised it again to address those who had supported the alliance. "You will not regret this decision," he promised, "and we will do everything in our power to ensure that your trust is rewarded with survival." The months that followed were filled with frantic activity as the combined forces of humanity and the Council prepared for war on a scale that neither had ever attempted alone. Human instructors worked alongside alien officers, sharing tactics that had been developed through generations of fighting creatures that defied imagination. And slowly the fear of the strange beings from the void began to transform into respect. Colonel Wade established training camps on a dozen worlds, pushing recruits through exercises that would have seemed impossible before the humans arrived. In the void, we learned that the body can do far more than the mind believes, he told his students. That fear is just a signal that can be acknowledged and then set aside. That survival depends on refusing to accept defeat, even when defeat seems certain. The Scythian officer Keth, who had first questioned human engineering, found himself assigned to the Joint Fleet as a technical advisor, and he worked alongside Amy Chun to modify Council vessels with human technology. "Your shields are more elegant than ours," Amy admitted as they studied the schematics of a Scythian cruiser. "But our weapons are more powerful, so if we can combine them, we might create something better than either of us could build alone." Keth nodded, his scales flickering with excitement at the challenge. "I never thought I would be improving designs that have remained unchanged for 10,000 years, he said. "But the humans have shown me that tradition is not always wisdom, and sometimes change is the only path to survival." On the Endeavor, Samuel watched the preparations with a mixture of hope and concern, knowing that even with all their combined strength, the coming battle would cost more lives than anyone wanted to imagine. Maria Santos had been promoted to admiral, given command of the human contingent in recognition of her calm leadership and tactical brilliance. And she spent her days coordinating with council commanders who had learned to respect her judgment. "We have 12,000 ships now," she reported during one of their planning sessions, "organized into battle groups with mixed human and council crews, but I still do not know if it will be enough." Samuel nodded, studying the holographic display that showed the Hollow's projected path through council space. "It will have to be enough," he said, "because this is all we have, and if we fail here, there will be nothing left to defend." Vethkara joined them, her expression carrying concern that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. "There are still voices in the council calling for retreat," she warned. "Species who want to abandon the outer colonies and fall back to the core worlds, hoping that distance will protect them." Samuel shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "Running will only delay the inevitable," he said. "The Hollow does not tire, does not stop, does not turn aside, and eventually there will be nowhere left to run." He looked at both of them, the Scythian diplomat and the human admiral, who had become his closest advisors. "We have to stop them here," he continued, "at the edge of council space, before they can gather strength from consuming your stars. And if we cannot stop them, then we must at least hurt them badly enough that someone else might have a chance." Maria placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "The crews are ready," she assured him, "human and council alike. They understand what is at stake, and they are willing to fight." Vethkora added her own assurance, her voice carrying conviction that had grown stronger with each passing month. "And the council stands with you," she said. "Perhaps not all of us, perhaps not as united as we should be, but enough to make a difference, enough to face the darkness together." Samuel looked out at the stars, wondering how many of them would still be shining when this was over. "Then we do what we have always done," he said quietly. "We face the impossible and we refuse to surrender. We fight until we cannot fight anymore. And we trust that somehow, against all odds, we will find a way to survive. The fleet assembled at the edge of known space. Thousands of ships from hundreds of species, united by fear and hope and the desperate determination to protect everything they loved. And in the darkness beyond the stars, the Hollow continued its relentless approach. A swarm of hunger and destruction that had consumed countless worlds and would consume countless more unless someone found a way to stop them. The final battle was coming, and the galaxy held its breath. The day the Hollow arrived was the day the universe seemed to hold its breath. And Samuel Briggs stood on the bridge of the Endeavor, watching the first wave of organisms emerge from the void like nightmares given form. They were vast beyond description, each one the size of a small moon. Their bodies twisted into shapes that defied the laws of physics as the Council understood them. And there were thousands upon thousands of them stretching back into the darkness as far as sensors could detect. All ships, this is Admiral Santos. Maria's voice rang across the fleet-wide channel, steady and calm despite the horror unfolding before them. Remember your training. Do not try to destroy them all. Our goal is to break their coordination and disrupt their feeding patterns. The first exchange of fire lit up the darkness with colors that had never been seen in Council space. Human weapons blasting holes in creatures that seemed almost surprised to encounter resistance. Council shields deflecting attacks that would have vaporized unprotected ships in seconds. But for every hollow organism that fell, 3 more surged forward to take its place. And within hours, the combined fleet began to suffer losses that no one had wanted to imagine. Ships died by the hundreds as the Hollow adapted to every tactic, every weapon, every desperate maneuver that the defenders could devise. And species that had never known war learned its brutal reality in blood and fire and screaming void. Keth flew his damaged cruiser through a gap in the Hollow lines, his scales pale with fear, but his hands steady on the controls. And when he saw an opportunity, he did not hesitate. "For the fleet," he shouted as he triggered his reactor overload. "For everyone we're trying to save." His ship plunged into the heart of a Hollow cluster, and the explosion that followed destroyed 17 of the massive organisms in a chain reaction that bought precious minutes for the defenders to regroup. High Warden Zex, who had accused the humans of treachery and demanded their rejection, found himself fighting alongside human pilots who treated him as a brother in arms. And when a Hollow organism threatened a human hospital ship carrying wounded from both species, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Corthan Fleet, follow me," he commanded, leading his entire force into the path of the attacking organism. "We will not let the healers fall." His ships were destroyed one by one, but they held the line long enough for the hospital ship to escape, and Zex's final transmission was a laugh of genuine joy. "I understand now," he said as his flagship crumbled around him. "I understand why the humans fight the way they do, why they never give up, why they face death without fear. And I am honored to stand with them." The battle raged for 3 days as the combined fleet threw everything they had against the Hollow swarm. And slowly, terribly, the tide began to turn. Human scientists working alongside Council researchers had identified what they called a command nexus, a central organism that seemed to coordinate the others. And if it could be destroyed, the swarm might turn on itself. Samuel gathered his senior officers in the Endeavor's conference room, their faces showing the exhaustion and grief of 3 days of constant combat. "The command nexus is deep inside the swarm," he explained, pointing to the holographic display. "Our weapons cannot reach it from here, which means someone has to go in." Maria shook her head, understanding what he was suggesting. "Sam, that is a suicide mission," she said. "Whoever takes that shot will not be coming back." Samuel met her eyes with the calm acceptance of a man who had already made peace with what needed to be done. "I know," he said simply, "and that is why I am taking the endeavor in myself, because this is my responsibility, and I will not ask anyone else to die for my decision." The arguments that followed were fierce and heartfelt, but in the end Samuel's will prevailed, and one by one his officers accepted that some prices had to be paid if the galaxy was to survive. "All hands, abandon ship," Samuel ordered as the Endeavor began her final approach. "That is not a suggestion. I need you to live. I need you to tell our story. I need you to remember what we fought for." Maria hesitated at the airlock, tears streaming down her face despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I cannot leave you," she said. "Not after everything we have been through, not when you need me most." Samuel took her hands in his expression gentle but determined. "You have to," he said, "because someone needs to lead our people after this is over. Someone needs to make sure the Alliance survives, and that someone has to be you." He released her hands and stepped back, his final words carrying the weight of everything he wanted to say, but did not have time to express. "Tell them I was proud," he said. "Tell them that every human who ever lived in the void was proud. And tell them that the darkness was never our enemy. It was just the place where we learned to shine." The escape pods launched as the Endeavor made her final run, and Samuel watched the command nexus growing larger in the viewport, felt the ship shuddering as hollow organisms tried to stop him, and thought of all the humans who had died before him, all the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. The weapon he carried was something no council species would have considered building, a controlled dimensional collapse that could erase matter from existence. The same phenomenon that powered the deadliest predators of the void. "For Earth," he whispered as his finger hovered over the trigger. "For everyone we lost in the darkness, for everyone we might save." The dimensional collapse erased the command nexus in a flash of light that burned across the battlefield. And without coordination, the hollow organisms turned on each other, their feeding instincts becoming self-destruction as the swarm that had threatened to consume the galaxy tore itself apart. When the silence finally came, the survivors counted their dead and found that the numbers were almost too large to comprehend. But they had won. Against all odds, they had won. And the galaxy would survive to remember those who had made victory possible. 1 year later, Vethkora stood before the council chambers and announced the formal admission of humanity to the Galactic Council, her voice carrying across the vast space where so many debates had raged. "They came to us from beyond the darkness," she said, "warning of dangers we refused to believe, fighting beside us when they could have abandoned us, teaching us that survival is not about avoiding hardship, but about facing it with courage." She paused, her silver scales catching the light as they had on that first day when she had announced the humans' arrival. "The galactic map once ended in darkness," she continued, "but now it extends into regions we never imagined, regions that humanity has called home for centuries. And they showed us that together we can face any darkness and emerge into the light." In the audience, Admiral Maria Santos sat quietly, wearing the insignia of the combined fleet commander, and beside her was a memorial plaque bearing a single name that would be remembered for as long as the galaxy endured. Samuel Briggs had shown them the way, and now it was their turn to walk it. The darkness was not an ending, it was just the beginning, and somewhere beyond the stars, humanity continued to shine.